I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Britain's Prime Minister prepares to hold defence and security talks with EU leaders for the first time since Brexit, we report from the front line near Pokrovsk in the Donbas, and later interview a West Point professor who says negotiating with Moscow is a doomed enterprise.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 3rd of February, 2 years and 339 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes, and Ukrainian journalist Varenytsia, just back from the front line of Pokrovsk. Now, overnight Friday to Saturday, Russian forces launched a large airstrike against Ukraine. I will go through the various natures of munitions, just because I know some people like to track these. They launched 7 Iskander-M or KN-23 ballistic missiles from Varenytsia Oblast and occupied Crimea. Also 7 Iskander-K cruise missiles from occupied Crimea and Donetsk Oblast. 8 Kh-22 cruise missiles and another 8 Kh-101 or 5.5 cruise variant cruise missiles from the big Tupolev bombers. 10 Kh-59 or 69 variant cruise missiles from aircraft over Varenytsia Oblast, that's just to the northeast of Ukraine, a small shared border, and 2 Kh-31P anti-radiation missiles from the Black Sea, as well as 123 Shahed and other decoy-type drones. Now, the Ukrainian Air Force said they'd shot down 56 of the drones, 61 more being lost to electronic warfare, and that Ukrainian countermeasures had prevented an unspecified, but they say significant number of Russian missiles from reaching their targets. However, Russia's ballistic missiles had a higher success rate. The Institute for the Study of War assesses that Russia is likely putting in a mix, firing ballistic missiles alongside all these other munitions in strike packages, so to overwhelm air defence. We know Ukraine's obviously got a limited number of systems capable of intercepting such missiles, and it's made doubly difficult when you've got a large target array. What do you go for? Now, one of the Kh-22 cruise missiles hit a residential building in Poltava city. Other missiles hit the historic centre of Odessa in the south, damaged the UNESCO, that's the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organisation, so damaged a UNESCO protected building. Yeah, I checked, and no, there was no comment from the UN about that. The Norwegian Foreign Affairs Ministry said Russian forces had hit an area where Norwegian diplomats were staying in Odessa. Drones also hit residential areas in Kharkiv and Kyiv oblasts. Then on Saturday, a dormitory holding Russian civilians and Ukrainian police officers was hit in Sudzha in Kursk Oblast inside Russia. 84 local Russian civilians preparing to evacuate from the area, and 4 Ukrainian police officers were inside at the time. We're told 4 people were killed, a similar number wounded. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian Air Force said Russian forces had conducted a glide bomb strike on the dormitory. That was dismissed by Russia's MOD and senior Russian officials who blamed Ukraine, saying Kyiv had fired a missile from Sumy Oblast. Russian mill bloggers backed that up, as you might expect, as did Russian state TV. Opposition outlet Agentstvo said Russian state-run TV stations Channel 1 and MTV blamed Ukraine for the strike, but at the same time also reported, whilst that was going on, Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian positions in Kursk Oblast had been occurring. There is no way of verifying, but I think I know which version of events I believe. Now, on the ground over the weekend, very little movement, but for the record, Ukrainian forces recently advanced near Toretsk, but Russian forces moved west near Chasiv Yar, Pokrovsk and Kharkov. We'll hear more from the Pokrovsk area shortly from Inna. And then on to today. And Armen Sakazyan, a pro-Russian collaborator from Donetsk Oblast who's wanted by Ukraine, died in hospital this morning after being injured in an explosion at a pretty expensive residential complex in Moscow. That comes from Russia's state news agency TASS, citing healthcare officials. Mr. Sarkisyan was severely injured when an unidentified explosive device went off in the lobby of the residential complex in northwestern Moscow as he and a number of security guards were, we think, leaving the building. Or I've seen reports saying they was going in, but I think it's other reports that I've seen and what I've seen from the ground looks like he was actually trying to leave the building at the time. Now, he's said to be a crime boss and a close former associate of Ukraine's pro-Kremlin ex-president Viktor Yanukovych. The Kyiv Independent, citing the SBU, the Security Service of Ukraine, said Sarkisyan has been on the international wanted list since 2014 for organising murders in central Kyiv. And then during the Maidan Revolution, he was reportedly the force behind the hired pro-government thugs who harassed pro-Euromaidan protesters. After the outbreak of the full-scale invasion, he founded the Arbat Separate Guard Special Purpose Battalion fighting against Ukraine. That unit is reportedly made up of ethnic Armenians, many of whom have criminal records. Now, news of his death and the attack on him comes as our colleague James Kilner reports in today's paper the death of a deputy governor of Russia's eastern region of Pokrovsk Krai. Said he was killed in fighting in Ukraine. If so, if it's confirmed, that would be the highest ranking official to die in the war to date. 51-year-old Sergei Efremov was killed apparently returning to Russian lines from a battle against Ukrainian forces in Kursk. He was reportedly travelling in a car blown up by a landmine, which also killed another Russian army officer. And also today, Ukrainian drones said to have attacked an oil refinery in Volgograd and a gas processing plant in Astrakhan in Russia last night. A source in the SBU speaking to the Kyiv Independent said that. Now, those sites are 300 kilometres east and 600 kilometres southeast, respectively, of Ukrainian lines. That the Astrakhan facility is right out on the Caspian Sea, continuing that series of, I think it was 15 in the end, wasn't it, through January, of long-range strikes by Ukrainian forces against Russian oil and gas energy infrastructure. So that's 2 for February so far. We'll have to keep the tally. And then finally for me, I mentioned at the start of this the lack of comment from the UN about the Russian missile strike on Odessa Friday, Saturday night that hit the UNESCO site. I'm pleased to say that the UN's human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine has not been so silent. They put out a news release on their website just a couple of hours ago. We'll put the link in today's episode notes, expressing, quote, alarm at a sharp rise in reported executions of Ukrainian soldiers captured by Russian armed forces, end of quote. Now, they say that since the end of August 2024, they've recorded 79 such executions in 24 separate incidents. Now, I will note that the mission also documented the execution of one wounded and incapacitated Russian soldier by Ukrainian armed forces sometime in 2024. So they investigate incidents from both sides. Now, the head of the mission, Daniel Bell, said of the Russian abuses, these incidents did not occur in a vacuum. Public figures in the Russian Federation have explicitly called for inhumane treatment and even execution of captured Ukrainian military personnel. We'll put the link in the episode notes, as I say, because it's a slightly longer quote from her. But yeah, good to see the UN keeping the focus on there. Now then, going to move on now. Roland's covering political and diplomatic stuff today in Francis's absence. Roland, quite a lot going on, actually. We'll turn to Joe in a minute for the sort of EU side of things. But what else have you been noticing on the wider political and diplomatic front?
Afternoon, Dom. Why don't we kick off very quickly with the stuff that's going on between America, Donald Trump, this big question of peace negotiations. So interesting stuff over the weekend. There's always a little bit of catch up. So the news today is that the Kremlin is saying it's too early to discuss four-way peace talks. And I'm going to tell you why Dmitry Peskov is saying that. So over the weekend, Keith Kellogg, that's the retired US Army general who is Donald Trump's envoy on Ukraine, gave an interview. He spoke to Reuters and he gave some indication of what the Trump administration is looking at. Essentially, he said two things that really seem to get the backup of the Ukrainians. That the first thing was a suggestion that, look, in a negotiation, both sides have to give some ground. He said that he claimed that Mr. Zelensky, The Ukrainian president has indicated that he's willing to soften his stance on territory, on holding on to territory. That is not been the official Ukrainian position for a long time. He said that the Russians would also have to soften their stance. And then he said that Ukraine will have to hold elections. So America making clear, it's still not formally nailed down, but it seems like it. America seems to want Ukraine to hold elections as part of any potential peace agreement. Now, remember that Volodymyr Zelensky's 5-year term was meant to end last year, but it was extended under martial law. Ukraine cannot, under its own constitution, it can't have elections under martial law. The Americans seem to be pushing for that to happen. There's a degree of concern about that. There is some pushback reported from Western officials and other types, and from the Ukrainians saying, look, you would risk opening up to a Russian influence campaign. You could drive a massive wedge between Ukrainians if you do this. In fact, Petro Poroshenko, I believe, over the weekend has also said that Petro Poroshenko, being Volodymyr Zelensky's number one political, bête noire, enemy. They do not like each other very much at all. But even Petro Poroshenko has said that this is a bad idea to have elections before there is peace. Nonetheless, that seems to be part of the idea that the Americans are beginning to push. Volodymyr Zelensky told the AP on Saturday that he wants four-way talks between the United States, Ukraine, Russia, and the European Union. So this is part of him getting his message out there. He says it would be very dangerous for Washington and Moscow to hold talks directly, and there has been talk about that going on. He's very much responding to rumors that the Trump administration and Moscow have already been talking to each other. I should add that Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, the Russian foreign minister, has denied that there's been any direct contacts, for what that is worth. So that's the context of all this. Dmitry Peskov this morning, the Kremlin spokesperson, saying that so far no one has discussed in any serious way a possible combination of participants in the negotiations. So far we're proceeding from the assumption that the Ukrainian president does not have the right to hold such talks. And there you have that election question coming in once again. So the Russians have long said that Volodymyr Zelensky is an illegitimate president because they didn't hold elections last year. You can see the Russians there effectively pushing for those early delayed elections. So that looks like it is going to be part of the debate in the coming months. The other thing, of course, that the Russians pointed out is that in 2022, Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree banning any talks with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin remained in power. And Peskov, I suppose, in a way, it's fairly obvious, really, he says discussing the possible composition of participants while that decree remains in force is probably getting ahead of ourselves. That is probably a fair point. The general point here, Dom, is that although Donald Trump has not yet spoken to Vladimir Putin, and remember when he came into office about 2 weeks ago, we thought it was going to happen quite quickly. It hasn't. Nonetheless, the process is underway. All this jockeying, all this positioning about these peace talks that we have been anticipating in the first few months of the Trump administration are underway, and we're beginning to see the outline of what that might look like, and elections in Ukraine look to be a rather big chunk of it. I'm going to mostly leave things there, Don, because I know that Joe's going to talk about the European side of things. I just wanted to flag that there's been a comment out of Copenhagen about this damaging of a subsea cable between Sweden and Latvia last month. You may remember there was a lot of alarm, a lot of suggestion that it was Russian sabotage. We're now getting things from a Swedish prosecutor says that a cargo ship called the Vezhen did damage a subsea cable linking Sweden and Latvia, but it was an accident, not sabotage. The investigation now clearly shows that it's not a case of sabotage. The prosecutors say, make of that what you will. I will leave it there and allow Joe to crack on with the big European stuff.
Thanks, Roland. We'll come back to you shortly when we introduce Inna. But just on your point there about these elections and there are no elections, but this narrative about elections, it is a proper Kremlin narrative, this demand for elections in Ukraine. I would point folks to Phillips O'Brien's latest, his weekend roundup. Phillips O'Brien being the Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews. Going to have a look what he says. It's a very good run through there. But essentially, he's making the point, why is Russia really pushing this line about elections needed in Ukraine for a number of reasons, mainly because, firstly, it undermines Zelensky right now. It also says that any settlement or any negotiation is illegitimate with Zelensky in charge, because the longer this debate rumbles on, well, it's not a debate at the moment, it's demands from Russia, unhelpfully amplified by some already in the Trump administration. But the longer they start talking about this context of elections, the longer or the more credence there is, the more credibility Russia has for saying, well, of course, it's an illegitimate president until he has elections. And then, of course, finally, what it does do for Russia, it legitimizes the ridiculous election that Putin supposedly won with whatever it was, 100 million% last year. They'll be saying, well, we had elections. We've got a full and free, fair, transparent electoral process. We've got a legitimate leader. They haven't had elections for years. How the hell are we supposed to negotiate with them? So really unhelpful, all this chat, uncontextualized chat from the US administration already about elections. But as I say, go and have a look at Phillips O'Brien and his weekend roundup for a much better explanation than what I've just offered. Anyway, Joe, Brussels correspondent, great to have you back. Britain's Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, he's in Brussels today. He had Olaf Scholz over for tea and checkers yesterday afternoon, and then Keir Starmer jumped on a plane. Now, it's the first such visit of a British Prime Minister to Brussels since Brexit. For talks today, we are told mainly trade-ish with the European Council, then a fancy dinner tonight with EU leaders where defence and security will be top of the menu. Ha ha, pun intended. Now, Joe, you may just about qualify for the EU's youth mobility scheme. What else should we expect from talks today? And who do you think holds the stronger hand in discussions about defence and security tonight?
Hi, folks. Quickly set the scene. I'm stood outside NATO HQ where Keir Starmer is about to meet Mark Rutte, the NATO Sec-Gen. In about a couple of hours, they're going to be giving a joint press conference. And then Starmer drives off over to the centre of Brussels where he's meeting EU leaders. You said on the menu it's going to be trade. That is slightly wrong, but it's being briefed in the UK that is the reason for his trip, which is just incorrect. EU leaders are speaking about defence and security, and that is it. They will have a whole host of things on their menu. Ukraine, Russia. They don't tell anyone, but they're speaking about Greenland and Donald Trump's overtures about the autonomous territory that belongs to Denmark's sovereign government and sovereign country. But they're also speaking about capability gaps. Does Europe have enough air defence? What about tanks? How do they fund the need for a huge rearmament? Can they work on a scheme that is going to bring EU countries together, like-minded EU countries, getting rid of the neutral states like Ireland and Austria, carving out the ones that are seen as pro-Kremlin like Hungary and Slovakia, and then bring in countries in Europe like the UK, like Norway, as part of a big plan which they think is going to require about $500 billion to rebuild Europe's defence over the next decade. That's how do they answer and how do they respond to Donald Trump's demands that Europe has to spend more and do more for its own defences? So that's really crucial. A few quick pointers and things I've been hearing and scoping out throughout the week. One of the things Roland was speaking about is this idea of Washington starting negotiations, and the EU are worried about being left out of that process. So I quizzed a few national ambassadors, highest representatives of the EU states in Brussels before their leaders arrive in town, basically saying, well, what are you going to do to make yourself part of these talks? And they're like, honestly, we're not going to preempt what Donald Trump's got in his mind. We don't know. And I was like, well, but that's not good enough. You need to make yourself valuable. So I think Europe is struggling to basically come to terms with the fact that Donald Trump and Moscow are actively trying, if not intentionally, maybe not intentionally, we don't know, to basically broker a deal which doesn't involve the European Union, which is going to be a massive problem because ultimately Washington is going to come to Brussels and say, we want European peacekeepers on the ground to uphold any peace agreement. It's a problem. But I know you've got a packed out schedule, so I will stop there and maybe I can pop on later on in the week to explain actually what has happened here, because we're still very early days. And say Keir Starmer hasn't, as far as I know, he probably is in town, but he's not actually met anyone yet.
Thanks, Joe. We'll catch up with you later in the week and we'll have a proper chat about what was actually decided or talked about in Brussels. Let's turn in the meantime to Ukrainian journalist Inna Varenytsia. Inna, delighted that you are able to join us today. Now, are you able to tell us where you are or where you are-ish and what you've been up to, what you've seen happening for the last few days? Welcome to the pod, Inna.
Hello. I've been to Pokrovsk a few times. during last days, and I just turned back also from Pokrovsk area, where I spent this night and morning watching how paramedics works and watching some troops, some Ukrainian servicemen who've got injured this night, and talk to them about situation on the front line as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, last one for me before Roland jumps in. But what is the mood at the front? I've been reporting for a number of weeks now that Pokrovsk has still held. The hard shoulder there holds, and Russia has made very small advances to the south and southwest. But what is the mood from a city that's under fire every day?
Well, we see Ukrainian servicemen consolidated together in their attempts to defend the city, and they are not emotional of losing the city, despite the situation is very hard. But I think they are more concentrated on attempts to save the city and to save the lives of servicemen on the front line. And I can say it about doctors, I can say it about soldiers as well, and about motivation, even if for some it's still hard, but some young people joined army themselves recently. I met the man, 18 years old, who just joined army 4 months ago, and he was already injured 2 times, but still he is willing to defend his country. But despite this, it's really, really tense to move towards frontline. And as for infantry, they understand that sometimes it's even safer to stay on the positions, not to replace each other each shift 10 days or something like this. They would like to stay longer because any movement in and out of Pokrovsk is quite dangerous.
You have been in and around the Donbas front for months and years, actually. Could you give us a sense of the dynamics in the area? Because we all watch the map and we've seen these incremental Russian advances and Russia closing in on that city for a long time. Is there a shift in the air, in the atmosphere, in the attitudes of people in the area?
I think, as from military point, I think that Russian troops are searching for new strategy how to act in this area, because if you look on the map, Pokrovsk is in better position from eastern side and worse position from western side, I mean from Dnipro-Petrovsk region side, because the Russian troops attacked there and broke the defense line. But now Ukrainian troops seem to try to stop the Russian advance. And as for last week, the movement of Russian troops is not so fast, but at the same time, they are controlling the road to Pokrovsk. And the Russian troops are targeting civilians as well. Each day during last week, civilians were targeted by Russian drones, despite they had signs on their cars, despite they had white tissue on their cars. So it doesn't stop them of attacking. And even British volunteer was injured during last week. He was evacuating people and he lost his limb. So we see that Russian troops are trying to control the key ways to Pokrovsk. And it's like a strategy which they used in Kurakhove area to control the road, to surround the city, but not to enter city fightings, because in case if they will go directly, they won't have a success. So that's why they are trying to surround the city itself. But still, the battle for Pokrovsk can continue weeks and months.
I think what's really valuable about talking to you is just you're there. You can smell it. You're seeing it. You're standing in those cold Donbas fields. What was it like driving in there? How vulnerable did you feel? You talked about the British volunteer who was hit by a drone last week. I believe he lost an arm and a leg. Were you in danger? Did you have similar close escapes?
Yeah, we drove to Pokrovsk a week ago. We visited Pokrovsk several times during last week, but one of those trips was not so successful, and the drone hit, I think, in meter or less, maybe half of a meter near us while we were driving across the train lines. and it's the most dangerous area, but it's the only one road. And we were targeted there. We had civilian cars, so we were also targets. But we managed to escape safe, only car was a bit damaged. And after that, we found out that Russian troops are targeting cars near the K roads mostly. So it seems that they have drones remotely all the time in the areas of roads, and maybe they are also using the new tactics or new kind of drones, and that's why there were so many casualties during last week. And as for possibility to live in cities, there is no infrastructure. The weather is quite mild in terms, it's warm now and sometimes it's sunny. But we know that in a few days it will be frosty, and for civilians it will be totally impossible in some houses to cope with the weather, and it's a big danger for civilians to stay in the city. We also we know that some parents are bringing back their kids to Pokrovsk, and police is trying to catch such people and to move them out of the city because there is a forcible evacuation for families with kids. And what I saw, what is the mood of the city? Inside city, when you pass this dangerous road, there is some life. Some shops still work, just a few, but still. And it's possible to get some drinking water. But it's not like a normal city anymore. There is no electricity, no gas, and for some its inhabitants, it won't be possible to pass through this winter because of those conditions. Some residents walk back and forth every day to city just because they have job there, which surprised me a lot. But I think it's also won't continue so long time because Russian troops are starting shelling city with artillery and with glide bombs. There was a hard attack on Tuesday with glide bombs. So the situation is getting tense and tense.
Ina, thank you very much for that. Very quickly, I was wondering if you could tell us about the other parts of Donbas or the front that you've been in. And I mentioned that because throughout the war, the center of Ukrainian Donbas has been Kramatorsk, Grushkivka, Slavyansk, that agglomeration. The Russians that's their long-term objective. And it always seemed almost slightly normal there. What's the atmosphere up there in Kramatorsk? Does it still feel relatively stable? And I was wondering if you also know anything about the recent fall of Velika Novosilka.
I'm not so good informed about Novosilka, but it looks like that Ukrainian troops are not there anymore. As for other parts, we know that situation is very tense in Toretsk. We were recently near Toretsk, and we know that city is divided by Russian and Ukrainian troops, and sometimes there are some street fightings there. And the situation is tense in Chasiv Yar because it can fall soon, but still Ukrainian troops defend a part of the city. And at the same time, Russia started to attack the cities with quite normal life, like Kramatorsk. Kramatorsk was hit probably with glide bomb, or we don't know exactly, more likely glide bomb. It happened last week. We were like in 500 meters from this area where it hit. It was on Wednesday. But fortunately, they didn't hit the area with shops where usually many people gather. But I think it's a sign that they are searching for another targets and they are trying to make people scary of next attacks.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ina. Dr. Robert Pearson is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Here he speaks to Francis Dearnley about why negotiations with Moscow are, in his view, a doomed enterprise, what Putin's grand strategy for Ukraine and the West has been in recent decades, and how the curriculum for future American officers has been forever changed by the war. This is their conversation.
I want to start, if I may, with your perspective on the issue of the moment, which is a negotiated settlement. We're, of course, entering this phase now where talks seem at least a possibility. But you believe, as Professor of International Relations at West Point, that that is doomed to fail and that the Trump administration are about to run into that reality head first. Really interested in your perspective. Welcome.
Certainly. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm a daily listener and a huge fan and deeply appreciative of all that you and the team do to keep the world informed. So before I answer your question, I do want to note that today I'm sharing my personal views based on my scholarly analysis. This isn't the official policy or position of the United States government or Department of Defense. But that said, having studied the region for my entire career now, I'm very skeptical of the prospects for a negotiated peace settlement in Ukraine. And I'm coming from the perspective of what we refer to as bargaining theories of warfare. This is a strand of international relations theory that has borrowed some insights from the broader phenomenon of bargaining to help understand the onset, conduct, and termination of wars. And you start with a simple premise that war is incredibly costly, as you and your listeners know. And so states should prefer a negotiated settlement to get what they would have otherwise gotten through fighting. And so if you can zero in on that, then perhaps there is room for negotiations. However, there are often three really significant barriers that can prevent a negotiated settlement in any conflict. So the first is what we refer to as issue indivisibility. Sometimes what states are fighting over in war are things that can be divided, and often territory is offered as the clearest example. You can draw a line on a map, divvy up particular lands, and perhaps make that the basis of a settlement. But oftentimes what states fight for are actually really quite difficult to divide. And so conflicts that are settled, that are centered on things like sovereignty, identity, a people's right to exist, that's much harder to divide 50-50, 60-40. So that's the first problem. The second barrier is the classic commitment problem. It's hard to guarantee that a settlement won't be reneged upon later, especially when there may be a long history of mutual distrust. Why would I sign an agreement if I'm pretty confident the other side will break it? And then the third sort of barrier is fundamentally boils down to a disagreement about the likely outcome of future fighting. It's essentially an information problem. Both sides often think that they have a chance at prevailing. They lack complete information about the other side's capabilities and resolve. Often they lack complete information about their own capabilities and resolve. And so states will continue to fight until there's a convergence of expectations. When both the winner and the losing side understand what the next round of fighting will bring, then they may be inclined to settle. Or mutual exhaustion, a true stalemate, may eventually induce them to seek peace. Now, the problem, according to my analysis, grounded in that theory, is that all three of these conditions are present in Ukraine. All of these barriers are there, and they are particularly intractable. And so when we hear all of the talk about negotiations now, the conversation tends to revolve around some division of territory, some territorial concessions that Ukraine might be asked to make, and of course, the question of NATO membership, security guarantees, Ukrainian neutrality. That's all part of the conversation. The problem is that that's not really what motivated Russia's invasion in the first place. Those aren't the root causes of the conflict. So any agreement based on some division of territory and some position of policies really aren't going to settle the war. And I'm happy to go into greater detail on each of those points. But as of this moment, I don't see any change to the fundamental issues driving the war. And that's going to be a huge barrier for any diplomatic settlement.
Well, please do go into more detail, because Of course, we are about to enter this phase of people really pushing for talks from, whether it be from Europe, from the United States, indeed some voices within Ukraine and Russia themselves. So what do you think is the next likely step, and how might some of those political theory ideas you've just put forward actually happen and evolve in practice?
Certainly. So I'll start with this problem of the underlying causes of the conflict. And again, you guys do such an extraordinary job of covering all facets of the conflict. And I think have shown in your reporting that really Putin's maximalist war aims have not changed in the last 3 years of fighting. And I would argue that, in fact, this is just the continuation of a 20-year war against Ukrainian democracy. And that is the fundamental issue at the heart of the conflict. Putin has been trying to decapitate the democratic government of Ukraine, neuter Ukrainian democracy, and install a puppet government for the better part of 20 years. That goes all the way back to 2004, when they tried to engineer the Ukrainian presidential election to install Viktor Yanukovych as president. That, of course, gave rise to the Orange Revolution. Fast forward to 2013, when he forces Yanukovych to veto the EU association agreement. That violation of Ukraine's sovereignty sparks the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity. And so then he invades the Crimea. He engineers the conflict in the Donbas to destabilize the Ukrainian government. In 2015, with the Minsk agreements, again, they try to force a backdoor hack into Ukrainian sovereignty. And so by 2022, all of his other measures to essentially install a puppet regime have failed. And at that point, he got it in his head that the only remaining solution, the way to finally settle the Ukrainian problem in his mind, was to go in with the supposed 3-day lightning strike to overthrow the government. So this is a very, very long conflict. And my assessment is that he's been pursuing this with singular focus for 20 years, which means that he's not going to give it up quickly or easily. And certainly in the Kremlin's rhetoric, we haven't seen any softening of those demands. The problem, to put it in theoretical terms, is that democracy, sovereignty, the Ukrainian people's right to exist as a people, that's not something that you can divide. That's not something that Zelensky can give 50% of. And so I think that's going to be very challenging to overcome.
What you're describing there is a grand strategy. And that, of course, is controversial in the Russian context, because some would say that Putin has, in a sense, seen what he can get away with. But you're describing it in more terms of he has a vision, he has an ideology that he is seeking to enact. So I just wonder if you could unpack that a little bit more before going on.
Certainly. So I think Putin has been, again, extraordinarily consistent throughout his now, 25 years in power, with the broad grand strategy that he's pursued for Russia, the vision of Russia's place in the world. And of course, grand strategy is all about establishing the huge geopolitical objectives that you're trying to achieve, doing so with a limited resource base, and then determining what are the most effective methods or ways that you can achieve those objectives. So strategy is the old formula of ends, ways, and means. It's all about trying to get that to balance on the geopolitical stage. And this is an area where, Putin, I would say, has been adept at times, but also stumbled into some spectacular failures as he tries to reshape the international system to put Russia back as a great power in a multipolar international system where Russia has this privileged and protected and uncontested sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. For much of his time in power, he's played certainly a weak hand vis-a-vis the United States and the Western allies. And so this is why he has, I think, often turned not just in Ukraine and in the post-Soviet space, but well beyond that to what listeners might recognize or describe as hybrid warfare. the instruments of political warfare, information war, economic warfare, cyber actions, things that traditionally have remained below the level of kinetic military action. And that's where I think this prolonged war against democracy worldwide has been a really critical tool of Putin's grand strategy.
Fascinating. Well, given what you've just said there and what you were saying before that, where do you think we're going to end up once these negotiations, if they begin, get going? What's going to be the next step, and what might that mean for the West and the United States' support of Ukraine?
Well, of course, I sometimes say that political scientists don't always have the best track record at predicting the future because there is so much uncertainty in the world. And I will say that most academics usually want to be proven right. This is a case where I actually very much hope to be proven wrong. I hope that my pessimism is proven wrong and that the new administration will be successful in somehow untying the Gordian knot and finding their way to a diplomatic settlement in conjunction with our Ukrainian partners. But again, I'm very skeptical, largely because of the Russian position. I think they're fundamentally the problem here. And so what I expect is President Trump and his team and General Kellogg and everybody working for them will make a good faith, strenuous attempt to find a deal. Again, I'm skeptical that they will be successful because I don't see Putin willing to give up anything, frankly. And so then really the open question, the million-dollar question is then perhaps how does President Trump and his administration react if he's not able to get a deal? And there we can only speculate. And I think you guys have discussed on the pod the whole range of possibilities of where that could go. And so it really is an open question. But I also want to emphasize here too, that if they are able to overcome the odds and manage to get some sort of agreement signed, we still face that really critical commitment problem. The fact of the matter is, Putin will never trust a democratic Ukraine or the democratic West. He won't trust any agreement we would sign, and we know that from his long history of mistrust and frankly, hatred of democracy. And obviously, Ukraine can't trust anything that Putin says or signs because he's got such a long history of violating agreements internationally. And so even a signed agreement, I think, would be extraordinarily fragile unless there's some sort of external commitment mechanism. And you guys have done a fantastic job on the podcast, really shining light on what an extraordinary task and challenge it would be to have some form of international peacekeeping mission. So I don't see that as a particularly realistic expectation. And so then we just fall back on this idea that Putin has been waging hybrid war against Ukraine and the West for 20 years plus. And so even if the guns fall silent, that hybrid war will continue. And so this is why I refer to it as Putin's forever war. Even if fighting is brought to a close, we will still be fighting in the shadows with Russia, and we need to be prepared for that.
As you'll know, I'm inclined to agree with your analysis, and you've put it so starkly there. I wonder if you can comment, therefore, based on all of the knowledge that you have of international relations, of negotiations, of the history of the region, if you were the one in charge of negotiations, or indeed in charge of the next phase of the war, maybe you wouldn't think negotiations should even be a starting point. What would you be suggesting that the administration does in Washington?
Certainly. Well, so again, reiterating personal views, not official policy here, I think that if negotiations are to have any hope of succeeding, if they are to produce any kind of negotiated settlement that is durable and conducive to stability and longer term peace and ultimately NATO's security, America's security, that of our allies, I'm of the camp that you want to go into those negotiations with the strongest hand possible, both collectively with our NATO allies, but also Ukraine's position on the battlefield, in the political sphere, the economic sphere. And so again, personally, I'm of the mindset of really applying maximum pressure now across all of the spheres, all of the domains on which we are, frankly, in struggle with Russia. And so that may very well be enough to induce that stalemate or to alter Putin's expectations about what happens if he continues fighting. And so that's the position that I personally would like to see, but obviously emphasizing I'm just a professor up on the Hudson River, and it's our national leaders and our allies that are tasked with the extraordinarily difficult challenge of figuring out how to face this unprecedented challenge.
Well, thank you for that. A really, really interesting overview of this very knotty subject, and I think it's going to become even more knotty in the weeks ahead. Let's change direction, if I may, which is about West Point and what it teaches in its approach to warfare. Of course, I'm thinking back here, I remember watching a documentary many years ago where when West Point was teaching officers for Iraq and Afghanistan, on the curriculum for them to read was T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And I just wonder what kind of reading material, what kind of academic topics do you teach them and your fellow professors about this war and what the lessons are and implications for the future of warfare?
Certainly. Well, I hope you'll humor me and give me a moment to step back and maybe tell listeners a little bit more about West Point's broader approach, because it really is a unique institution that has developed over the last couple of centuries. So as you know, our mission, our fundamental mission, is to commission about 1,000 young officers every year to lead a military force that's powerful enough and lethal enough to deter America's adversaries from starting wars in the first place. And so when President Trump now talks about peace through strength, that's essentially a deterrence mission. Now, if deterrence should fail, then these young men and women will be called on to lead that lethal force into battle to fight and win the nation's wars. So that's our most fundamental mission. Because of that unique mission, the study of war and warfare is really woven throughout our whole curriculum. Now, we're a little bit different. Your listeners in the UK certainly may be familiar with the Sandhurst model. We're different in that we are a 4-year broad-based curriculum. The cadets study engineering, natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and they all graduate with a Bachelor's of Science degree. So to give you some examples of how this then is woven throughout our curriculum, our engineering capstone projects, they may be doing research to develop innovative solutions to battlefield challenges and working on new technologies. Our law and philosophy department is teaching cadets about the law of armed conflict and just war theory. The Department of English and World Languages, they are reading that extraordinarily rich literature of war. We teach military history, the economics of national security. My discipline, international relations, they read some Clausewitz. War is the continuation of politics by other means. And so we really look at the political aspect of war. And I'm also happy to share with you that they are just starting up a new interdisciplinary program in war studies that actually takes some of its inspiration, I understand, from the world-renowned program at King's College London. And so this will be a place to integrate all of those themes and all of those threads in the study of war, because we know that warfare as an instrument of national power, it is political, it is economic, it is social, it is technical. And so thinking about how we can educate those future leaders to not just deal with the challenges of today, but those of tomorrow, that is really critical. And so we have a lot of unique opportunities to do that through our curriculum. We've been very fortunate in some cases to have some Ukrainian partners come and speak to the cadets, present to them, share with them their experiences from the battlefield. And so that's been extraordinary.
Is there a particular focus on certain aspects of warfare, like drone warfare, for instance?
Yes, yeah. That has been a big part of some of the presentations that I've seen. They've also obviously had lots of interesting things to say about societal resistance. And again, the information war that they have been on the front lines of. And I'll mention too, our NATO allies in the Baltic region obviously have been at the front lines of Russian information warfare for decades now. And so whenever we have the opportunity, whether in person or virtually, to bring some of those voices into our classroom, it's always a great developmental opportunity for our cadets. The other piece that I want to mention, if you'll allow me, we have a really unique faculty model at West Point that is also sort of part of what I like to call the secret formula. So 20% of our faculty are civilian academics like myself. We bring that deeper disciplinary expertise into the classroom to help provide that intellectual framework of how to think through these really tough challenges. 20% of our faculty are senior military officers. They're very accomplished scholars in their own right, but also have extraordinary leadership experience in the Army. The remaining 60% of our faculty are mid-level Army officers, captains and majors, who earn a graduate degree in a discipline. They come to West Point, they teach for 3 years, and then they go back out into the Army and continue to serve. And so what that does is they are coming from the active Army. They're coming from units that have been stationed in Poland, that have been in the Indo-Pacific region. So they're, in a lot of respects, coming from the front row seats of these conflicts. They come and they bring that experience and those insights and their perspectives into the classroom with them in their disciplines to help cadets understand that. And then they take their intellectual capital back out into the Army and continue to try to help the Army think through these challenges that then they face operationally.
Sharp tools intellectually and physically, as it were. Yes. If I may, just a couple of other questions because we're running out of time, unfortunately. If we're looking historically at West Point and its role in the United States and indeed more broadly over the world and its influence in shaping world affairs, I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about that and perhaps its vision looking beyond its past as we enter this new phase of 21st century warfare that involves hybrid, that involves disinformation. There's been many people who've said that conventional warfare, as we understand it, is now definitely something of the past. Do you agree? Do you get that sense of the mood shifting, or is it all a bit more complicated than that?
Well, we know from the entire human experience that the nature and the characteristics and manifestations of warfare are always changing. And whether you go back to Agincourt and the revolutionary effect of the longbow, you pick any moment in human history and you can find extraordinary transformations in warfare. And so from that perspective, we try to take an outlook that recognizes the importance, frankly, of critical thinking. We don't know what the conflict of the next decade or decades will necessarily look like. It will probably be, by the time my cadets are themselves generals in the Army, things will have transformed in extraordinary ways. And so we have an unofficial motto, shall I say, at West Point that we teach our cadets how to think, not what to think. And so it really is about putting in front of them some of the really vexing challenges so that they can struggle with it, so that they can exercise those mental muscles and be equipped to think through whatever challenge the future may bring them, however warfare changes. And so I go back to that formulation of strategy as the combination of means and ways to achieve strategic ends. And we can talk about strategy at all sorts of levels. It can be battlefield strategy, tactical operational, all the way up to that big geopolitical grand strategy. But that activity of a strategic leader still is going to depend on being able to think through all of the trade-offs, all of the limitations, opportunities, challenges in order to make the right decisions to, again, lead that effective and lethal fighting force.
Well, Robert, I'd love nothing more than to talk to you further about the history of West Point, particularly in the American Civil War, of course, having educated officers and generals on both sides of that conflict. But sadly, we are out of time. But my final question to you is there anything that we haven't touched on today, that we haven't talked about, that's on your mind that should be on ours?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity. I will say this to the listeners. There's obviously lots to be worried about in the world today. We are well aware of the threats to international security, stability, and prosperity. Those threats are real, but I do want to reassure my fellow Americans and our allies around the world that West Point remains focused on our mission to deliver to the nation 1,000 intellectually sharp, physically fit, and morally sound leaders of character. We'll do that this coming May at graduation. We'll deliver another 1,000 to the Army the following year and 1,000 after that. I have the privilege to spend every day with these extraordinary young men and women, and knowing that they're the next generation of leaders, it actually gives me a lot of hope and comfort for the future, despite the looming storm clouds. And so I hope to pass on a little bit of that reassurance to all of those who understandably have anxiety about our world today. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. And then the second thing, if I may, is to just express my gratitude and admiration and utmost respect to you, Francis, and to Dom and Adelaide and the entire team behind the scenes. The work you do is extraordinary. As I said, I depend on you. I listen to you every day to stay up to date on everything that's happening. The different voices and perspectives that you bring onto the pod really, I think, provide such a dynamic and rich picture of this conflict. And so I just want to say in closing, I think there's no better way to continue honoring David's legacy than continuing the critical work that he started. And so I know I speak for a lot of academics over here, policymakers, and like-minded folks who really just can't thank you enough for your work.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Persson. That's so kind of you to say. And thank you for your time today.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can follow this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.